Yes, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our first dialogue for the year 2024. The 2024 Zimbabwe Dialogues, where we are trying to tease out the question, what's next for Zimbabwe's wildlife economy? And these dialogues are coming to you through the African Wildlife Economy Institute, which is part of the Stellenbosch University in South Africa. And we are glad that we have our partners who support us as well. And in this regard, we are talking about the Oppenheimer. We also have Zella, and we also have other partners that support us in the process. And I would like to welcome you all to today's session, where we will look into the insights from the Zimbabwe's Biodiversity Economy report, live coming to you through the African Wildlife Economy Institute. And we all know that in September last year, in 2023, the Zimbabwe Ministry of Environment, Climate, Tourism and Hospitality Industry released the country's first report on its biodiversity economy. And this report was focusing on the Zimbabwe's biodiversity economy and trying to describe the current trends, the status of the Zimbabwe's biodiversity economy, fostering investment in the responsible use of biodiversity. And this report sets out the importance of biodiversity and economy. And one of the key things that this report highlights, and I quote, is that the biodiversity economy encompasses the economic benefits that are derived from sustainable use and or conservation of indigenous species in their natural habitats. It includes the business transactions related to wildlife, wild capture fisheries, indigenous forestry, bioprospecting, wild harvested non-timber products, includes biotrade, if we might put it that way, and the supply of ecosystem services. It delivers economic gains that are not recorded within the gross domestic product of the country, including subsistence livelihood benefits, health benefits, ecological functions that underpin the economic production or serve costs in other sectors. This is what is underpinned by the report. So ideally, we are looking forward to having the speakers for today and the conversations and the dialogue and the question and answer segment or section about what's next regarding the Zimbabwe biodiversity economy. And for that reason, I would like to introduce to you Prudence Como, who is part of ShareScreen Africa, to introduce the speakers for today's dialogue or session going forward. My name is Victor Mposhi. I am an African Wildlife Economy Institute Fellow and a Conservation Leadership Faculty and the Academic Manager for the School of Wildlife Conservation for the African Leadership University. I'm also affiliated with Botswana University of Agriculture and Natural Resources as an associate professor there. And I'm glad to be with you today. Over to you, Providence. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. As Victor's already said, my name is Prudence, and I'm here on behalf of ShareScreen Africa. For today's talk, I'd like to welcome Mr. Farai Mutondoro, who's a coordinator from the Africa Institute of Environmental Law, and Ms. Novesu Tungwenya, who works for ZimParks, which is the Zimbabwe Parks and Wildlife Authority Management, who's a senior ecologist.
Thank you so much, Prudence, and many thanks to Professor Mposhi for setting the context for this discussion. So Again, my name is Farai Mtondoro. I coordinate the Africa Institute of Environmental Law, and I was part of the team that developed the Zimbabwe Biodiversity Economy as commissioned by AWEI and the Minister of Environment. So I think to start with, I will make reference to the fact that this is a document owned by the Government of Zimbabwe, which is now in the public domain for continuous interrogation. So many thanks to AWEI for creating this platform for us to reflect on what's next post the finalization and the launch of the biodiversity economy. But before I respond to that question, I will take you through a roadmap of what we obtained when we went to inquire in terms of what is the status of the biodiversity economy in Zim. The first thing which we got from government was keen and eager to realize potential economic benefits from nature or from the goods and services that nature does offer. So government said they want to have an analysis of the state for the biodiversity economy in Zim, and more importantly, to come up with a framework to account the contributions of nature into economic contributions through the natural capital accounting framework. So guided by this, we're supposed to look at the overview of protection and status of biodiversity in Zim. What is the contribution of biodiversity economic subsectors, and what has been the changes over time? Who are the key actors involved? What are some of the barriers, and what are some of the opportunities that can be leveraged on? For the investment blueprint, our key questions related more to build what can be done to build on growth opportunities and to mitigate barriers identified in the ZBE. Then for the natural capital accounting framework, which I will not devote much attention to, we sought to create a guidance for the development of an NCA. What are the data needs and broader methodology that is required? So my presentation will speak more to the analysis on the ZBE and partly on the investment blueprint. Government was clear that it had prioritized 4 subsectors: 1, wildlife, 2, forestry, then bioprospecting and biotrade, and lastly, forestry. So I'll speak more to bioprospecting and biotrade, and I think Nove will speak more to issues around fisheries and wildlife. So when we did the assessment, we looked at the priority subsectors that government had deliberately chose to focus on. So in terms of the literature review, we did spend much of our time reviewing the literature that is in existence in terms of published literature and grey literature, massive stakeholder consultations, accessing freely accessible geospatial data, analysis of land tree cover trends over time using sources like the Global Forest Watch. We did spatial modeling for nature-based tourism. Then we need this modeling again for the non-timber forestry products in Zim. So jumping into the key subsectors, bioprospecting was one of the key priorities, which we got from Government of Zimbabwe. We noted that globally, and I think you would agree that there's a multi-billion-dollar industry globally, the bioprospecting, in light of the pestilences and COVID-19. There's an emerging and a booming market for bioprospecting. But we noted that in developing countries, the sector is still small and largely untapped, but there's huge potential to earn foreign currency, to stimulate economic development, local value addition, and so forth. We noted that in developing countries, there's a missing link the need to tap into bioprospecting. We noted that prior to CBD of 93, most developed countries extracted genetic resources without consent of host communities and governments in developing countries. We saw that in terms of the challenges relating to bioprospecting, there is lack of mandatory implementation of the access benefit sharing arrangements with source communities by private companies that are commercially exploiting genetic resources. We noted that within some communities, there's lack of awareness of access benefit sharing agreements by companies. If companies go to Matopo, for instance, to extract marula fruits, communities in Matopo, they have no idea on what access benefit sharing agreements means. There might be bylaws, but some of the bylaws by local authorities might not have been developed to suit to the new requirements and new opportunities that this offers. We realize that there is also contravention of the Nagoya Protocol and Section 13.4 of the Constitution around consultation and communities benefiting from resources that they are endowed with. When it comes to bioprospecting or non-timber forestry products, we noted that there's limited institutional capacity to monitor implementation of the access benefit sharing agreements due to overlaps in legislation. So there are multiplicity of legal instruments regulating bioprospecting, as it were, or non-timber forestry products. So you would see that the RDC Councils Act comes into play, the Environmental Management Agency Act comes into play. We have the National Biotechnology Authority, which would come in play. There's the Standards Association of Zim and the Medical Controls Authority of Zim. So there are a lot of legal instruments that are there, but they all kind of overlap. So the overlapping makes it so difficult to hold one agent accountable. So if people are to go to Gwanda and harvest Matlimbi or Madora, as we call them here in Zim, there's no dedicated agency which would do the enforcement of bylaws or the enforcement of rules and regulations. MI has a role to play, the police have a role to play, RDC has a role to play. So the lack of clarity on who does what does compromise on government's ability to effectively monitor and implement the provisions of access and benefit sharing agreements. But more importantly, there's limited implementation of the Environmental Management Act and the SI 61 of 2009 around access to genetic resources and indigenous genetic resource-based knowledge in Zim. More importantly, the study noted that there is lack of mandatory implementation of ABS arrangements with source communities by private companies that are commercially exploiting genetic resources. I think one beautiful case report which you reviewed was a doctoral thesis by Scott was showing that within different communities, companies are trading in different ways. If communities are aware of ABS arrangements, the company might in a way try to negotiate and ensure that communities benefit. But in communities where there isn't that knowledge, companies are in a way preying on communities or preying on host communities. So there's lack of awareness of ABS by companies. I think government needs to do more and civil society to raise awareness among communities so that they can hold companies accountable. But there's also voluntary adoption of ABS arrangements which deprive source communities. Then, like I said, there's contravention of the CBD and Nagoya Protocol and also Section 13.4 of Zim Constitution. Coming on to the challenges, we reflected and noted that there's lack of policies and laws that recognize the rights in protecting indigenous knowledge systems or traditional knowledge systems. So pharmaceutical and cosmetic industries regulated through the intellectual property rights. These identify individual specific companies as the owner of the rights to knowledge and do not recognize indigenous knowledge systems. So communities in Zim, they know what Zumbani is used for. I think much of that information came through when we had COVID-19, but this knowledge has not been patented. And some resources are transboundary, making it difficult to identify the rightful community to benefit from ABS arrangements. Coming on to what can be done to address these challenges, we noted that we need to enact new laws that recognize traditional knowledge systems. There's need for the National Bioprospecting Authority to develop a database of all indigenous knowledge systems and traditional knowledge systems from plant and animal genetics. There's need to enact laws that make it mandatory to enter into ABS arrangements for products related to trade on domestic and international markets. But before that, I wanted to speak to a chapter which I did before I got to the investment blueprint. I looked at the value chain of non-timber forestry products, where through special modeling, we noted that there's around $500 million that circulate in the trade of non-timber forestry products but though at a substantial level where you go to our informal markets, be it the Mbari Sika market, be it any market in Blawa, you see people selling wild fruits, from wild berries, majanje, selling matimbi. So through special modeling, we noted that the value of that industry in Zim at subsistence level, meaning to say, if there is increased policy support and investment by government and other critical actors, we can grow the sector that it contributes more to the economy. Then, interestingly enough, I think as we're concluding on the study, Dairy Board introduced a product called Mawuyu Cascade, where they are combining whatever ingredients they have with baobab, which is there in abundance thanks to the Mayombo woodland. So that's a typical example of how the private sector, through research, through innovation and partnership with communities, can develop products that have a market in Zim. Beyond thinking of the international market, I think the domestic market itself can consume some of the goods and services that can be derived from non-timber forestry products. We noted that due to climatic conditions and weather arrangements in Zim, it's not conducive to continuously rely on food that requires on synthetic fertilizers like your grain, for instance. But you have an excess of baobab that can be used to produce cereals and substitute grain and corn for things like your mawuyo or baobab powder. In a sense, you create benefits for communities. In a sense, I think you also move your agricultural systems to what is climate friendly and climate smart in terms of agricultural production. We noted that key products and services from nature in terms of the non-timber forestry products includes your thatching grass, which is having a huge market in Zim, baobab powder, but beyond baobab powder, the oil itself, the oil from baobab and marula, is feeding into the cosmetic industry where people need antioxidants, but they also need to beautify themselves. We saw the value and potential of things like honey, for instance, although Ethiopia has a huge market in terms of honey, but we believe and we noted that Zimbabwe, things are standardized and the market is well developed through a regulatory agency and an exporting agency and the marketing authority of some of these goods and services, we can grow the market for honey, your marula oil, and your zumbani tea, for instance. Having said that, I think I want to quickly speak to one or two slides around the investment blueprint and allow us to have a conversation. So the key questions which were guiding us are, what are the key growth opportunities in the biodiversity economy? What can be done to encourage investments and growth in these particular areas? And what can be done to encourage investments and growth in the biodiversity economy more generally? These were the key questions which guided us in doing in developing the investment blueprint. So we noted that in terms of key growth opportunities, there's need to realize the potential of state protected areas in Zim, and I think Nove will speak more to that, but also to encourage conservation on communal and private land, to tap into the demand of novel natural products. I think my chapter looked at what is the valuation rather of the antioxidants and baobab industry. I think it's an amazing market within Europe, but Africa is the source of much of the baobab that is needed in terms of resolving antioxidant issues. But leverage on payments of ecosystem services to secure payments service from natural habitats. I think Zim has been on global media around the Blue Ocean deal with the people from Dubai around carbon trading. So these are some of the growth opportunities that does exist in Zim that we need to leverage on. I hope I'm doing well in terms of time, moderator. Then how do we realize the potential?
Actually, Farai, you have about 5 minutes. We're running out of time.
Fantastic.
Yes.
So let me ask them to conclude and leave time for Nove. So in terms of realizing the potential of state protected areas, I think Nove will speak more to this in terms of partnerships and co-management arrangements to increase revenue for conservation and visitor infrastructure, to invest in high to low development through competitive breeding processes, investment in domestic air and road connectivity. I think it's difficult for some people to travel to Victoria Falls. It's very difficult. The road network is so bad. But if we looked at the visitors that frequent Victoria Falls, for instance, there are so many people trafficking to Victoria Falls, some using air, but most using road connectivity. So I think government needs to do more in terms of improving the state of the roads for the sake of growing this economy. I want to conclude on this slide, then take questions and engage. In terms of encouraging conservation, land use on communal and private land, I think this discussion comes right on time. I think there have been demolitions and discussions around communal land in Zim. We recommend the need for special zoning to identify areas where wildlife could be an optimal land use option. Areas like, I think government have done it before, like your Save Valley Conservancy, where you don't need to do agriculture, you can do wildlife farming. Then more importantly, legislative change and capacity building to support community conservance and joint venture development. I think the couple issue presents a unique case study that beyond benefits from wildlife itself, communities can accrue benefits of preserving nature, preserving trees, and not causing deforestation. Then lastly and more importantly, improve tenure, security, encourage investment in wildlife enterprises. So some people, they are eager, or investors are eager to invest in the biodiversity economy, but the tenure arrangements are not friendly for investors. So if government is to grow the biodiversity economy in Zim, it needs to seriously reconsider issues around tenure and ownership of wildlife. I think South Africa brings an interesting case study where people can own wildlife. So there are people who might be willing to invest in that, but the current laws are not allowing. Over to you, moderator, so that I leave time for further discussion. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you, Farai, for that very comprehensive report. Nobesutu, will you please come and present?
The host has unmuted me. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for this opportunity to have this dialogue on such a critical topic, and also for the organizers for actually putting this together. And thank you so much, Farai, for taking us through the first part of the presentation. So I'm going to hone on the wildlife sector and also talk about the fisheries sector as well, which were all part of the biodiversity report that we worked on. And particularly to also mention that, when you're looking at the wildlife sector, the report itself actually focuses mostly on sport hunting and photographic tourism. Of course, there are other components that we also focused on that included game production, zoos, and other types of protected areas and their use and contribution to the economy within the country. And then also with the fisheries, you find that in the report, it speaks mostly of the indigenous capture fisheries and also honing on aquaculture, which is actually a key component in the economy and also amongst the largest in Southern Africa. So looking at nature-based tourism itself, you find that 6.3%, there's a 6.3% contribution to the GDP, and with protected and conserved areas contributing 1.7% to the GDP. And the report did also explore the impacts of COVID-19 in the sector, showing a decline, of course, of the 75% tourist numbers in protected areas. And also we found that a third of visitors in the country actually do visit protected areas, and there was, however, very limited data on the biodiversity-based tourism component within the country. So it was really difficult to tell who is coming in, especially for research purposes or for the biodiversity or ecosystem services benefits within the country. Then you see that even with our nature-based tourism, with the data we used Flickr, which we used to develop this map to actually show where the economy in terms of tourism is coming from, attraction tourism. And this was based on like photographs, which are geo-referenced, and it shows where most of the photographs are actually taken in the country. So you find that you have a lot of attraction-based tourism for example, in the Northwest Mastabeleland, that's your Hwange National Park, and also where there's the Victoria Falls National Park, and also in the northern part of the country. So more looking at sport hunting, which was actually a very key component in the report. You find that, okay, so sport hunting is really taking place in areas that are not suited for photographic tourism. And this is where you have your key species such as your lion, your leopard, the sable being hunted and also contributing to the economy. And also with like more than 70% of the hunters coming from the US, for example. However, in Zimbabwe, the industry really has been on the decrease, like since the 2000s, and due to several forces such as the global perceptions on hunting, the trophy import bans, and also, the increased negative reputation on the industry. And of course, there are other factors such as the quota setting process itself. There are illegal hunting issues associated with the decline in the industry, and also habitat loss and all the other effects, which can also be natural. So I find that from the hunting, like the trophy fees, your tusked elephants are the ones that are actually contributing the most, followed by the buffalo, and then the lion and leopard. Those are the amounts that they are actually contributing in terms of revenue. And then the trends in trophy hunting, as I indicated, they've been declining, but they've been ranging on average, like generating from the daily rates, trophy fees, the guest rates, and all the other fees that are associated with hunting. On average, you find that it would range, you get approximately 25 million, sorry, 25 million from trophy hunting revenue. And looking at the institution that is actually mandated to manage wildlife in the country, the Zimbabwe Parks and Wildlife Authority, it is sustaining and has to generate funds itself to contribute to conservation. So you find that over time, over the years, the institution has actually been operating at a deficit. And this is where external have been coming in terms of assisting with conservation itself in the protected areas. So, I mean, that really shows how expensive it is to do conservation at the same time. And then in terms of sport hunting revenue outside protected areas, we do have campfire, and the income has generally been stable. I mean, campfire generates on average $2 million US. And you can see that really COVID-19 has an impact on the funds generated from 2019, 2020, and going into 2021. But generally, you do have some council rural districts performing well in terms of generating income, but then this is also dependent on the size of the wildlife area that you have in that community area. And it also depends on the number of species, the level of protection and all that, they all come into play. And what exactly is there? For example, you find that in areas such as Matopo, you might not find lions, meaning the hunting revenue will also exclude lions in terms of the calculations. But this really, in terms of campfire itself, it has to some extent managed to involve communities in conservation. However, even in the report, it recognizes that the recognition of RTCs is an appropriate under campfire. It has made campfire really fall short in terms of fully devolving rights of wildlife to communities. You have leases being signed by RTCs, and really sort of reduces the community's autonomy over decisions that are made. So this is where it also limits like the opportunities when it comes to the wildlife enterprise opportunities, and also other issues that have to to do with land ownership, land tenure. That way, I mean, Farai highlighted on those as well, because there isn't, it would really, the Act, the Parks and Wildlife Act is not explicit in terms of wildlife ownership, and that also has an effect on how the economy in communal areas or in the outside protected areas can actually be explored effectively because of that lack of ownership, and also issues to do with governance and the benefits that are actually coming from conservation in the campfire system. I mean, I was just looking at this table, which was actually put out in, I think it's a recent report from WTTC, and also it was highlighted in a CITES report, which was looking at financing elephant conservation. So if you look at Zimbabwe, the contribution to GDP in terms of elephant range states, it will contribute, the wildlife sector in terms of elephant contributing 6.5%. But if you look at all the other countries, you do have, for example, Namibia with 14.9% contribution. And also if you look at the countries that are around Zimbabwe, just in Southern Africa, Zimbabwe has the highest elephant densities. And yet in terms of contribution to GDP, we still, I think there's still more that can be done. It shows that there are opportunities that can still be explored in the wildlife sector, especially regarding to elephant conservation. And then other barriers to opportunities, of course, there's that I mentioned earlier, perceptions to trophy hunting, trying to overcome the gap of the funding gap, and also issues to do with the campfire model itself. There has been a campfire review, seems still in process, but also there's also a draft Parks and Wildlife bill, which we hope will actually also help in issues to do with devolution to local communities and ensuring benefits. And also land tenure issues that I mentioned earlier, and leveraging on economic imperatives for wildlife-based land use systems. Okay, and then the fisheries sector, basically, we're looking at the fresh water within the country, and we have our dams, and the type of fisheries that we actually are focusing on in the country, the capture and recreational or aquaculture. So those are the three types of fisheries. And you find that in terms of governance, the recreational parks that have water bodies are all managed under the Parks and Wildlife Management Authority, and we have the small water bodies which are outside protected areas being under the Ministry of Lands, Agriculture, Ministry of Lands and Agriculture, and also under the RTCs in the private sector. So the challenge is that there is really, we do not have a fisheries policy, which is like a standalone legislation, in all the fisheries or the fresh water is being managed under the Parks and Wildlife Management Authority in terms of main legislation. So this is data from the capture from the capture of the fisheries production, which really has been stable and also increased later from 2013 going to 2019. In the production of the capture fisheries really has been up to about $62 million US. The aquaculture also has $102 million contribution, and we find that all this really, it's really because in Zimbabwe we have one of the largest aquatic culture fisheries in Southern Africa, and been performing very well in terms of the contributions, and the contribution to reaching 1.5 into employees really increased over time from about 2,900 to 3.4 people being employed in the fisheries sector. But it is also an important component in terms of protein to the rural communities. So what are the barriers and the recommendations, the need for this legislation, and also the need for coordination in terms of the ministries that are managing the fishery sector, and coordination in terms of research and monitoring for information itself. And there's also issues to do with co-management of fisheries for sustained production. Yeah, and also aquaculture, there's still really high potential in terms of growth in aquaculture, and also looking at the value chain itself from production to the end product and where the fish are going to, and also, you know, the strategies I think I've mentioned earlier in terms of strategies for fisheries, and also investing in the research and also partnerships that I indicated earlier. Yeah, so I think that's it from me in terms of the wildlife sector. And yeah, thank you. Over to you, moderator.
Thank you, Nobe. You were right on time, so thank you for that. So right now, we will go to the question and answer section. If anybody has a question, a comment, please raise your virtual hand or put it in the chat. Oh yes, we have a question in the chat from Louise. I actually know Louise from St. Parks, but she doesn't know me. I once sent her my research proposal, but she says, sorry if I missed it in the presentation. Did the report look at the relative contribution of trophy versus non-trophy hunting?
Okay, do you want us to respond to the questions right away?
Yes.
Or?
Yes, I think we can do it back and forth.
Okay, so in terms of the report did look at trophy hunting because the data was easily available, but then in terms of non-trophy hunting, that was limitations there because of availability of data, and also looking at the value chain itself. I think this is something that was also highlighted in the investment blueprint. Like if you look at trophy hunting, you're only looking at the trophies, and what of the other products, you know, if you were looking at the leather itself, the fat and all that is coming from that particular animal, you know, if particularly with elephants. So that is really, was difficult to chase and put the data together, and also look through it through all the values, you know, in terms of what is coming out from the tanning industry and exports from the leather and all that. I think it's good that the report actually did identify all this, and there's opportunities to actually explore and research on those and find out what is really happening and how much in total we're getting in terms of you know, exports and utilization in the wildlife sector. Thanks.
Thank you, Nobe. There is a comment from Holly that I would like to integrate to a question, but she says, I have understood that there is also an intergenerational decline in trophy hunting interest among millennials in Generation Z in North America. So I don't know if you picked that from your report, because I know your report is from last year. So have you seen that because the older people are now older, have you seen that there's less people coming in to do the trophy hunting, like less younger people, or you didn't look at that?
Yeah, actually, we did look at that, and where most of the hunters were coming from. The report included, I think, even in that I did indicate the 6% in 70% of the hunt from the youth. However, I think it's actually interesting the breakdown of age groups, and you know, if you're saying that there's a decline in interest from millennials, I think that really is an opportunity towards exploring. I think the report really also looked at mostly in terms of the decline, it was mostly on the effects of COVID-19, but I think that's an interesting area to also explore, Holly, in terms of looking at the ages and the millennials not coming for hand. Yeah, thank you for that.
There's a question from Stefania. They say, does the report include any climate change impact assessment in connection with the development of the biodiversity economy and its sustainability?
I could take that, and they can also come in. I think the report from the point of departure, I recognize that the triple planetary crisis is forcing Zim to rethink on how best to salvage its economy. But we didn't go in depth in looking at climate change assessments. But in somewhat way, we noted the impact of climate change on the biodiversity economy in terms of wildlife trade in Zim and the capacity of your national parks to meet on their mandate. So it was not rightly out there that we did a climate change assessment in this report, but the government itself, I think, recognized that.
Okay. Nobe, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think Farai is very right here. Though we do the report to look at just the payment of ecosystem services that are linked to, the climate funds and also the RED projects and all. But then the impacts of climate on the wildlife economy. I think that really the aspect in terms of the contributions did focus on the RED project and also the payment system services. Yeah.
Okay, there's a two-part question from Steffi Hiller. They say there's a strong belief that sport hunting revenues only reach a few people or companies who make the most out of it. It would be very interesting to see how the revenues are spread out in reality. Then they actually explain and say, they mean that the revenue is seen, but is there explicit distribution? For example, hunting outfitters outside and inside the country may be broken down by examples.
So that is really an interesting angle of looking at it, because when we're looking at hunting, getting to protect areas, campfires, and also in terms of what is actually obtained. And really, if you look at the campfire program itself and also the private areas where sport hunting is being done, there is revenue that is generated. But in terms of the use and how it's distributed and all, it was really very difficult to break down. But yes, the report does break into the private campfire in state areas. I hope I answered you.
Yes, we'll wait to hear from Steffi. I don't know, Frank, would you like to ask your question live or would you like me to read it out?
Sure, I can do it live. It's fine. So there was a really nice part of the report is looking at fisheries and with a focus on protein, and the harvesting of mammals, of kudu or impala for protein is another topic. But there seems to be this sort of pushing from wild harvesting of fish to also aquaculture in the country, which is farming, fish farming, which isn't really wild anymore. And the same thing could happen with game, with farming game. And so I was wondering if the report sort of looked at how do we keep game and fish wild vis-a-vis how do we end up with wild species becoming farm species?
Yeah, that's a really tricky one, because honestly, looking at the aquaculture industry, it's the species you really not in us. It's really an effect on the body, especially if you look at Lake Kariba. The Niloticus itself has really taken over the lake, and and also I think most of the focus in terms of aquaculture, fish farming in the report has been from it was using data from the protected areas. So you find that most of the data that was used was from Lake Kariba, because that was what was available. But then there are so many water bodies outside protected areas. And these actually most of them do not practice fish farming. So that is one opportunity as well. But then what they generate and what actually is harvested for protein, or the contribution, if there's anything that is traded from the dams that are not protected, or those that are in communal areas, it was not easy to get the data, and there really is need to know what is happening there and also effectively explore the wildlife economy in those areas outside the parks. Yeah.
Cool. I noticed that in your presentation and in Farai's presentation, you guys bring up a lot of involvement of local communities and maybe coming up with a law that looks at traditional knowledge system or indigenous knowledge systems. And I know Zimpox has a very complicated relationship with local communities, especially indigenous knowledge things. So I don't know, how do you see that playing out here? How do you see the practical ways in which you actually get the local people and the indigenous communities involved in this?
Yeah, that's a very difficult question, especially for you, Nove, but I think you would better respond. But I think beyond just finding ways to address the problem, I think is identifying the root causality of the lack of cooperation between host communities and the Parks and Wildlife Authority. And I think in our analysis, we noted that communities at the time, they bear the brand of coexisting with wildlife through human-wildlife conflict, but there are no tangible benefits that are accruing to communities. So Campfire came in, but again, there were concerns about the distribution of funds from Campfire. And I think in this report and other outside engagements we should do as Zella, we prescribe an approach where we need to broaden benefits to communities. So beyond benefits from hunting, for instance, there are benefits from non-timber forestry products. So things like supporting conservation enterprises, where communities are trading and having access to the market of things they accrue from non-timber forestry products. But beyond that, I think we spoke about Red Plus, the carbon trading. Again, it will be a huge source of conflict if local authorities are the only sole benefiters from carbon trading without benefits accruing to communities. So what you then end up seeing is retaliatory killing. In terms of what Parks needs to do, I think there's an ongoing discussion around appropriate authority in Zim in terms of where does appropriate authority sit? Should it sit with the private sector, local authorities, communities? How do we do it? So that conversation is around benefits, community benefits from coexistence with wildlife. Over to you.
I don't know, Nove, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting one. You know, the relationship between authorities and communities, it not really. But I think, as Farai has just put it, the issue to do with creativity have been understood with the community. Also, if you look at where we are as Zimbabwe and where we were when Campfire started, there are a lot of opportunities in terms of the wildlife enterprise that can be explored in communal areas. If you talk of the communal conservancies, just leveraging on the land use systems. I mean, I think the report also indicated that there could be benefits that can be realized from ranging or wildlife use or promoting wildlife land use in some of the communities. For example, looking at the ranges that were in the Southeast Lowveld. When they started, they had cattle. And after they mixed the cattle with wildlife, they actually tripled the revenue that they got from those ranges. But the issues to do with benefits and where the benefits are going and how that also works out at the end of the day is really it's really a critical issue, and that needs to be addressed going forward. And we're hoping that with the new bill, the draft bill that might actually be coming out, approved, or some of these issues might be addressed. Thanks.
Cool. There's a comment from Louise, and she says, there's a point on diversifying wildlife economy income opportunities for sustainability or resistance is important. Remembering that this means keeping options open so that people can choose rather than narrowing choice. This needs a flexible legislative environment. And I guess that partly answers you, Farai, on your question about where should Zimpox sit or the regulatory authority. Our last question is going to be from Kirsten Neke, who's an ecologist. She says, is there an issue of overstocking and overgrazing in game-stocked areas? And is this in any way related to those areas designated for hunting?
So the issue of populations that are exceeding the carrying capacities and it's mostly in areas where there isn't hunting. Of course, we do have, you know, the thing is the protected areas are in Zimbabwe, the way they're designed, because there are some that have hunting and those that do not have hunting, and they're all probably adjacent to each other, maybe even divided by a rod. There's no fences that actually separate these. So you might actually find that they share the same population pool. So if we talk of populations, for example, in the northwest Matabeleland that include Hwange, I mean the Khaza TFCA part of Zimbabwe, you find that the populations actually increased. I mean, with the latest Khaza counts of elephant numbers. So it is actually, it encompasses both areas that have, that do hunting and those that do not do hunting. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you, Nobe. We're quickly going to put a feedback survey into the chat. May you please spare a minute or two to just quickly answer a few questions and let us know how the session went. With that said, I'd like to ask Wiseman to do the closing remarks. Thank you, everybody, for this very insightful conversation.
Thank you very much, Prudence, for that. And thank you very much, everyone, for attending this event. It was a wonderful presentation from our two speakers who have given us a very insightful discussion about the wildlife economy in Zimbabwe and how the government and also the practitioners see the economies developing around the wildlife. So I would like to say thank you on that, and I hope that you'll join the rest of our series. As you are aware that we are also hosting five 1-hour series that is until the end of March. So the next one is scheduled for the 22nd of February, which is focusing on empowering the community conservancy model. We have another one also that is scheduled for the 29th of February, which is the following week after that, commercializing the use of wild plants. And we'll also be having another that is certifying sustainable use of wildlife species, wild species, animals and plants, and of course, other products that are related to wildlife. So the closing series on that will be enabling a sustainable wildlife ranging sector. So I'm looking forward that we participate in this and we continue to unpack the report and looking at the opportunities that the report presents and how we take forward the Zimbabwe biodiversity economy. And in our attempt, of course, trying to answer what next then for the Zimbabwe's wildlife economy. Speaking is Wiseman Ndlovu at Stellenbosch with the African Wildlife Economy Institute. See you in the following series. Thank you very much and enjoy your day. Bye.